Good morning. Here's your morning intel report for Tuesday, November 29, 2022. Inside the Beltway. White House, President Biden is scheduled to travel to Bay City, Michigan, where he will deliver remarks about jobs and the economy at semiconductor manufacturer SK Siltron. Congress, the Senate will reconvene to continue consideration of the Respect for Marriage Act. The Senate Select Intelligence Committee is scheduled for a closed hearing. The Senate Foreign Relations and Environment and Public Works Committees are scheduled to hold hearings on pending nominations for ambassador and administrative positions. Defense, Secretary Austin is scheduled to host Colombian Defense Minister VELASQUEZ at the Pentagon. Army Major General Davis, Commanding General, U.S. Army Recruiting Command, will speak at a Heritage Foundation event, Solving America's Military Recruiting Crisis. State, Secretary Blinken is scheduled to attend the NATO Foreign Ministers meeting in Bucharest, Romania. Domestic Intelligence Summary. Analyst comment, a rail strike remains a short-term domestic concern. Yesterday, President Biden called on Congress to intervene and impose a September agreement mediated by the administration. This agreement does not have any of the additional benefits asked for by the unions which voted down the deal so far, and the threat of congressional intervention removes leverage the rail unions had for further negotiation. Negotiations for an omnibus funding bill in Congress have stalled. As the December 16 deadline approaches, a continuing resolution becomes more likely. GOP control of the House in January will give Republicans leverage in negotiations on a funding bill. Mexican President Obrador signaled that he is open to exceptions to a proposed ban on corn imports from the United States. This will provide some relief to American farmers who export corn used for livestock feed to Mexico, the second largest export market for U.S. corn. Biden calls on Congress to avert rail strike. House will consider legislation. President Biden called on Congress to codify without modification or delay the agreement the administration brokered between rail unions and companies in September. In the statement, President Biden warned that attempts to modify the deal in Congress would risk delay and a debilitating shutdown of rail networks. Speaker of the House Representative Pelosi said the House will take up a bill without any changes to the negotiated terms of the agreement this week. Government funding bill deadline approaching while negotiations stall. Congress is facing a December 16 deadline to pass an omnibus spending bill to fund the government. According to Representative Cole, Republican Oklahoma, serious negotiations on the spending bill have not started yet, and Senate Appropriations Vice Chair Shelby, Republican Alabama, told reporters that discussion on top-line figures might heat up after the December 6 runoff election in Georgia. According to Congressional Quarterly, Senate Appropriations Chairman Leahy, Democrat Vermont, and House Appropriations Chair DeLauro, DCT, are writing an omnibus bill that includes priorities and earmarks from both parties to attract bipartisan support. Obrador meets Agriculture Secretary, signals exceptions to corn ban. At a meeting with Secretary of Agriculture Vilsack, Mexican President López Obrador said that he is considering exemptions to a proposed 2024 ban on GMO yellow corn imports from the United States. According to the USDA, Mexico is the second largest export market for corn from U.S. farmers. DOT rejects farm group request for trucker exemption. Booker introduces farm liability bill. The Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration in the Department of Transportation, DOT, rejected a request from agriculture trade groups for an exemption from federal driving time regulations for drivers who transport livestock. The agency stated that the request would not meet an acceptable safety standard. Senator Booker, Democrat New Jersey, introduced the Industrial Agriculture Accountability Act that will place liability for disaster response on corporations and industrial operators. The act will establish a fund, paid for by fees on industrial farms, that will be used to enforce disaster mitigation plans and ensure humane slaughter practices. RC. Analysts say stocks don't reflect recession risk. According to strategists at Goldman Sachs and Deutsche Bank, the stock market does not reflect the risk of a recession in the United States. The strategists stated that their model implies a 39% probability of economic growth slowdown, but risk assets are only pricing in an 11% probability. According to the strategists, this increases the risk of further recession scares. Russia-NATO situation report. Ukraine resumes blackouts after continued Russian missile strikes. Ukraine officials on Monday said they would impose regular blackouts across the country after Russian missile strikes continued to set back attempts to repair power grids and critical infrastructure. According to officials at DTEK, Ukraine's biggest private electricity producer, power units at several power stations were forced to conduct emergency shutdowns, resulting in a 60% reduction in electricity supply to the country. Once the causes of the shutdowns have been repaired, the units are expected to return to operation. Russia is using extreme cold weather in the region as a weapon to disrupt Ukrainian military and civilian activities. It is likely that Russia can destroy Ukrainian infrastructure faster and cheaper than Ukraine can repair it, putting Kyiv on the horns of a dilemma. ECB President Lagarde, Europe inflation yet to peak. The head of the European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde, said Monday that she didn't believe inflation in Europe has peaked. According to Lagarde, the European Central Bank, ECB, is set to continue raising interest rates to stave off inflation, currently sitting at 10.6%. Lagarde said the inflation target remains at 2% and that the ECB will use all the tools we have to reach that target in a timely manner. The ECB is following the U.S. Federal Reserve in pursuing interest rate hikes while still printing vast sums of money to sustain government operations, including supporting Ukraine in its war with Russia. Expect a continued series of aggressive rate hikes in both the EU and the US as prior rate hikes have had a less than desired impact on rising inflation. China and Indo-Pacific Situation Report. China increases internal security operations over protests. Chinese security forces began increased internal security measures Monday following a series of weekend protests in major urban areas across the country. Police began stopping and searching pedestrians in Shanghai and Beijing, although there were no signs of protests on Monday. Police are also searching mobile phones for signs of VPNs and Western social media applications like Telegram, which are outlawed in China. Chinese stocks saw their worst day in a month on Monday as volatility rocked commodities markets over the anti-COVID unrest. Reuters reported today that Chinese authorities were already searching for participants in the weekend protests. Zero COVID is a keystone policy of China President Xi Jinping, and it is unlikely to be rescinded over the latest series of protests. Authorities are softening restrictions among certain elements of the population but expect security forces to ramp up operations to identify and remove protest leaders and any others that fall into its security dragnet. Pakistani Taliban withdraw from ceasefire agreement. Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, TTP, also known as the Pakistani Taliban, announced Monday that they are withdrawing from a months-long ceasefire agreement with the Pakistani government. The announcement comes just ahead of a planned visit to Kabul by Pakistan's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Hina Rabbani Kar, on Tuesday, where he planned to hold talks with Afghan Taliban intermediaries of the TTP. The TTP is an umbrella group of Pakistani tribesmen that control the lawless regions along Pakistan's Afghan border. They have traditional ties with the country's intelligence service, and elements within the government and military are known to be sympathetic to their cause. Pakistan is a nuclear-armed country, with a history of nuclear proliferation, on the brink of a financial crisis led by a caretaker government fighting two separate armed insurgencies. The deposed former prime minister is currently agitating for new elections, despite an assassination attempt in early November. The security of Pakistan's nuclear arsenal could soon be a growing concern for Washington, D.C. India's month of military exercises. The Indian military is participating in several military exercises with Indo-Pacific allies this month. The annual UDABOS exercise, which ends on December 2nd, includes training with U.S. Army units for humanitarian assistance and various warfighting techniques near the Indian-Chinese border. The Indian Army is also involved in Ostra Hind 22 with the Australian Army until December 11th. Finally, India quietly conducted a missile test on November 23 across the Bay of Bengal and will be conducting another test in the Andaman Sea between November 29 and December 1. Global Situation Report. Colombia launches military offensive against rebel groups. Colombia's Interior Minister Alfonso Prada announced Monday that the Colombian military was commencing a new offensive against illegal armed groups operating along its border regions. Prada stated that Colombia was seeking the assistance of its neighbors in the fight against various armed groups made up of the remnants of National Liberation Army, ELN, and FARC guerrilla armies. Newly elected Socialist President Gustavo Petro promised guerrillas and narcotic traffickers they would receive reduced prison sentences if they submitted to justice, turned over their monetary assets, and shared details of their trafficking routes. Dutch tech company says no to Biden chip sanctions on China. Dutch semiconductor technology company ASML said it would not participate in the Biden administration's ban on selling chip-making technology to China. The Dutch government is siding with ASML, which manufactures high-end deep ultraviolet (DUV) lithography machines and has already sold over 200 to Chinese chip manufacturers. Dutch Trade Minister Lee Schrijmacher said, "It is important that we defend our own interests, our national safety, but also our economic interests." Sanctions coalitions rarely operate as a monolith since every country has differing national interests. Reports coming out of South Korea indicate that it also declined to participate in the Biden chip wars against China, and even American chip manufacturers are devising ways to get around the U.S. Commerce Department's new technology transfer rules. Japanese companies Tokyo Electric, Canon, and Nikon are also selling chip manufacturing tech to China, despite that country's massive military buildup in preparation for conflict with China in the East China Sea. Expect China will still be able to build out its own semiconductor manufacturing sector, despite U.S. sanctions. DoD considers integrating commercial satellites. In a recently released memo, the Defense Department stated its intent to stand up the Task Force on Commercial Space System Access and Integrity. The task force's mission will be to identify and integrate U.S. non-military, commercial space assets into the DoD's operational picture while mitigating potential loss of access to those satellites during wartime. Using commercial satellites for imagery, vessel and aircraft tracking, and information systems would greatly enhance the military's operational awareness during wartime while reducing research and development costs. One major concern is that this makes civilian space assets and their support systems lawful combatants in any future war. End report.